crystallizes, i.e. it crystallizes and memorializes something after the event. What I've tried to argue is that as often photographs look to the future, they're aspirational, they're forward-looking, they point to a desired future state that has yet to be realized. So to my mind, it makes much more sense to think about photographs as being on the cusp of the future, rather than, as almost everyone else does, photographs being a kind of blast from the past or a kind of shadow of what's happened. Photographs, to my mind, very often show their desire to engage what is yet to happen. So someone who's picked this up is Karen Strassler, who wrote a great ethnography of Javanese photography called, there's a typo here, it should be called Refracted Visions. And she talks about, uses this phrase, the as-if in studio portraiture. So she observes that many people who are going to have their portraits taken in studios don't go in and say, I want you to picture me as I am. They go in, they look for a backdrop, they look for scenery, they look for props, and they make themselves into the as-if. And the power of the camera then is its ability to capture this subjunctive, this future-oriented, aspirational state. Here we could then throw in a third term, the proleptic, which is the sort of ratcheting up then of this move to the future. And the proleptic is a way of talking about a future state that has already been achieved. And it strikes me that a lot of Indian rightist Photoshop, it's enthralled to the proleptic. It's discovered that Photoshop allows you to achieve an instantaneous future. You don't have to wait for a 5-year plan. You know? So you can, like here on the left, after Modi's meeting with Abe and his promise of bullet trains whizzing up and down the Gujarat corridor, they instantly appeared. Without the, in 20 years' time, we hope that. But they were there. The image performed this proleptic power. It took you there. You didn't have to, put out to tender to hire people to reroute bridges and all the boring stuff. So a huge amount of what's been happening Photoshop-wise is exploiting photography's proleptic potential. It can give you the future immediately, and it can persuade you about its existence in the present. I'm not sure I have a comment on these. We encountered Paul Valéry earlier, and one obvious question would be, is he too European for this context? So recall that his model was that it was the kind of Homai Veerawala model, that to photograph something you need a camera person, and you need the thing that's being photographed. If you don't have any of those, you haven't got a photograph, unless something apocalyptic like Photoshop comes along, which can dispense with some or most of that. So it strikes me that as an anthropologist, one could say, one's response to reading Valéry might be to say, hang on a moment, but this is just, this comes out of a blinkered European cultural tradition. And if you look more broadly, you can see that in fact there have been lots of image making and quasi-photographic practices that have always been happy to dispense with elements of those things that Valéry said were essential, or have always been happy to rearrange the sequence in which those things encounter each other. So if we were to go back into fairly deep history, it strikes me a big thing that one would need to consider is David Shulman's argument about what he calls mind-born worlds. So this is a fantastic book called More Than Real. It's about the triumph of the imagination in the 16th century in South India. And essentially what he says is that, what he traces in immense detail, is that people started to talk in new ways. So they didn't think, we must build a temple on top of that hill, and where will we get that beautiful white marble from, and etc., etc. But they started to think, well, they started to say things like, in my mind, I am going to build a temple, and it is going to have these qualities. And so you had a privileging of the imagination, of mind-born worlds, worlds that could be conceived here and which were thought to be all the more powerful because they were not corrupted by material factors. So he opens that book, More Than Real, with an account of a South Indian devotee who proves at great length that this imagined entity is the thing that matters most. And of course the implication of his title, More Than Real, is that these works of the imagination claim a greater status than simple artifacts in the world, tangible artifacts in the world. The other thing he says, which I think is possibly interesting in the context of what's happening with Photoshop now, both with Trump and Modi, is that he traces their rise, the rise of this empowered imagination, to shifts in social and political structures. So he says that it's newly empowered, the newly empowered South Indian imagination reflected pressures from the Nayakas and a cash-oriented economy with its new opportunities for self-made men, free from ascriptive determination. So he's suggesting there's this, a transformation in society in which you have all these social urges that demand that people be able to make themselves anew. What better tool than the imagination, or what better tool in Trump's America than Photoshop? So I think there's some potentially very interesting trans-historical and global echoes, resonances. I wouldn't put them any further than that maybe can help illuminate why it is that at certain moments, which is not just down to technological innovation, why are technological innovations at certain moments grasped and fast-tracked and embraced? What are the social and cultural factors that underlie those? Going back to is Valeri's despair too European, I think it strikes me the other thing you could do is you don't have to enter the high world of South Indian 16th century South Indian theories of imagination. You can go into local photo studios, and this is from a Madhya Pradesh studio, probably late 1970s. I worked on this studio in the last 30 years or so. What you have to grasp here is that the phones that these people are speaking down are not connected to anything. There is no interlocutor at the other end saying, Namaskar, there's nothing is being said, only they are holding these phones. And my interpretation of this is that they're speaking to the future. That's why they go to photo studios, because they want to become modern men and they want to hear the future. It's almost like listening to a seashell, trying to divine what might be going to happen. So in photo studios there are huge numbers of images of aspiration, of longing, of fascination with what lies beyond the cusp of the present. What is the future bringing? Usha and I copied these just yesterday in Pinney. These were taken against, probably in the 90s. We copied the surviving negs. Taken in the 90s against, I don't know if you can just see this fantastic, elaborate airport backdrop So Panoti is not an international air transport hub. This is something about future longing. This is something about aspiration, the desire for escape. It's saying something about how photography is a kind of natural ally of movement, of travel, of expansion, of reconfiguring identity. So if you think of Strassler's as if, I mean, this is the kind of pure form of the as if, the subjunctive. So your pose mirrors the kind of angle of the taking off plane. It's filled with extraordinary promise. So you go into this, small sort of cloistered space in this small, relatively remote town, and there's this. I mean, it's like something out of the Matrix, a key to another world that opens up some fantastic new time-space continuum. That's right. So what I'm trying to say is that the other thing one can say about Valéry, is he too European? Well, yeah, maybe he was, because he had a particular view of what photography, he had a normative view of photography, and if you look at global photographic practices, people actually doing all kinds of things with photography, and a lot of it has always been much closer to Photoshop anyway. If we had time, I would give a little discursus on Gita Kapoor's work and Anuradha Kapoor's work, both of whom have written very powerfully about what happens when chromolithography is introduced into late 19th and early 20th century India. And one of the consequences of which, Anuradha Kapoor says, is to make the time of the gods and us the same. So this is obviously a critique. What they see as scary in the work of people like Raja Ravivarma and others is the idea that these new techniques of representation, oil painting, oleography and so on, allow the gods to step seamlessly out of their time and their world into our world. And for them, their sacred world was from that moment under threat, because it was became an incredibly short journey between the world of humans and the gods. So there would be lots of precursors to this that we could, if we had time, we could fill this in with. And then there would also be digital cut and paste, manual cut and paste montage techniques, very widely used in the 60s and 70s and through the 80s in Indian photo studios. This is actually done on Photoshop, but it has the kind of crudity of those earlier physical artisanal montages. But of course this is all subject to the ratchet effect of Photoshop. So if you go to Krish Digital in a little alleyway just south of VT in Mumbai, you can buy DVDs with huge TIFFs. I mean, they're like 120 megabytes per TIFF. And these are sold to photo studios. Photo studios throughout Western India are increasingly being normalized, systematized by these very professionally made Photoshop templates. And then the job of the often very small photo studio is just to cut and paste the head of their clients into these fantastical bourgeois dream worlds. And again, coming back to Nepal, Usha and I just earlier this week met a very fascinating person in Bhaktapur who shared with us his Photoshop experiments, which involved putting himself, his wife, in these wonderful designer living spaces. This is someone who experienced a good deal of trauma as a result of the earthquake, and one possible narrative is to see this as a way of securing the future against the precarity of the present. there's one great one with Carly in the living room. Okay, so I have a little bit more to go. I should speed up. So I could just give you bullet points on some of these other things. So the other way you could flesh out the critique of Valéry is to say that the history of photography is littered with photographs that had problems attached to them, that lied in the popular parlance. So Felice Beato goes to India in April 1858. He makes a load of money selling prints of mutineers being executed, but he's 6 months too late. What he's selling pictures of on the left are ordinary felons being executed. This picture has nothing to do with the mutiny. The only connection is through the label that Beato gives it. Similarly, on the right, perhaps much more famously, Secunderbag in Lucknow. By the time he arrives, it's 6 to 8 months after the storming of this building. All the bodies of the sepoys have been buried. He pays someone to dig up all the bodies, scatter the bones, because he wants an exciting, newsworthy image that he can make money on. Another quick example, V.D. Sarvarkar, the Indian Hindu nationalist in his first Great War of Independence, uses this image with this caption, "Indian Revolution is blown from the mouth of guns." He actually says it's a painting, which it is, by this painter, Vasily Vereshchagin. That Sarvarkar's use of it seems to feed into a Nazi 1941 publication, Robber State England, where it then becomes a photograph. It's captioned as a photograph of the English blowing mutineers from the heads of guns. It turns out that Vereshchagin was in India in 1877, and this is a painting of Namdari Sikhs being executed for their role in cow protection disturbances. It has nothing to do with mutiny, and it's not a photograph. But if you look for this image on the web, you will see it in a lot of Indian languages captioned "photograph of mutineers being executed by having their heads blown from the heads of guns." So there's already, has always been a lot of fake news, fake images, misdirected information that's been part of the public sphere. And I suppose the consoling message from that is that we've just about got by. Right, so because of shortage of time, I'm going to wrap up in 5 or 10 minutes. Is that okay? So I won't talk about these incredibly powerful 4 images from Auschwitz that the French art historian Didier Huberman writes about very brilliantly, except what I wanted to draw to your attention is that what interests him and what interests me a very great deal is that the images are not powerful simply because of what they record. They're the only 4 images known to be in existence that record deaths in the Holocaust, in camp situations. So there are lots of images that document journeys to the camp and the aftermath, but these are the only 4, incredibly, that document killings. And so they have a huge evidential significance. And if you Google them, you'll see that most of the time they've been rotated and cleaned up. They've been turned into different kinds of photos of evidence. And what Didier Huberman wants to do is restore the original moment of the terror of their making to sort of show us how truly evil they are. And the way he does that is to map the movement of the photographer in relation to the photograph, to present a kind of phenomenology under conditions of unimaginable terror. And it's thought that a German Jew called Alex was the photographer, and he was waiting to pass the film to the Polish Krakow resistance, which he managed to do. So what we see is him hiding inside this oven, taking up different positions, and then in the other two images he's running round the side of this building to escape. So the images as corporeal artifacts tell this incredible story of bravery and terror. But they take us back to the event, so these images are all about the event of the making of the photograph. I mean, I can't think of any other set of images that give you a more visceral sense of the fact that there was a camera person, a camera, an event. That's what you read from these images as he makes a mad dash, and if you have time to study them carefully, they're really chilling and extraordinary. Okay, so let's move to my punchline, if that's indeed what it is. I found the closing argument essentially is that there's no such thing as the digital. The digital is a fantasy. It's a fantasy about being weightless, frictionless. It's about a kind of pure immediacy. It's about that zone that lacks mediation. And I wanted to think about cow protection agitation and Photoshop that goes wrong as showing the ineluctable, irremovable material dimension that lies at the heart of the fantasy of the digital, what I call analog grit. So very briefly, there's a Finnish academic whose gender I can't decide, unfortunately, called Jana Seppänen, who's written a very interesting piece very recently, arguing that images from Mars rover, so these NASA images, transmitted over 400 million kilometres, which are always presented as kind of archetypally, purely digital, are in fact ineluctably material. They rely on photons, they rely on electromagnetic data. Anyway, it's a virtuosic argument to show the residue of the material that lies at what we might think of as fundamentally digital. So I found this very interesting as a way of thinking about Photoshop and the cow protection agitation. And I'll just talk very briefly about those two things and then stop. India Today ran a feature with the headline, "Too Much Photoshop Love." And what they did was list the worst BJP-related Photoshop disasters. So, and I thought there was something very interesting in that headline, "Too Much Photoshop Love." So Photoshop is something you can use, but it's also something you can misuse if you're insufficiently critical or insufficiently skilled. And so too much Photoshop love suggests that Photoshop can self-destruct through Photoshop. And I wanted to look at just a few of those. But the best ones come from China, actually. And what I'm interested, so this is supposedly officials in Anhui province in 2013 looming over a miniaturized senior citizen. There's a bit of journalistic description here now in what appears to be a still from a horror movie. This is an image put out by the provincial government that was supposed to promote Chinese government activities and their welfare of senior citizens. And they ended up producing what looks like a scene from a horror movie in which these enormous officials are scrutinising this tiny-year-old centenarian. There was then a lot of recriminations, and the local photographer had to explain that the room was so small that he couldn't take just one shot. He had to take one shot of the centenarian and then another shot from another angle of the officials. So what he's telling us there is that there was an event of photography. In the end, he was actually constrained by the material smallness of his ability to move his camera around, and then late at night in a rush, coerced, oppressed by regional authorities, he superimposed the two images and came up with this monstrosity. So anyway, that then, picking up this performance creates deformance. I mean, what are the good things that come out of these totalitarian attempts to mislead us? Well, there was a lot of social media commentary in China that took this up. It truly portrays the social ecology. The image of the officials is glorious. The people are small and humble. Others suggested that the officials must have been looking at real estate or scantily clad women because of their enthusiastic expressions. And then there was then even more famously, I'm sure some of you are familiar with these, 3 road inspectors who were ineptly photoshopped, and which various internet memes then photoshopped rather brilliantly, putting them in all kinds of unlikely positions. So Photoshop, too much Photoshop, can be dangerous. I mean, this is not simply a tool of state power. The state wants it to be a tool of its power, but it's subject to what we could think of as an auto-deconstruction. So in India, most famously, the Modi, what's known as window wonder, backfired. So he was going to see the effects of flooding in Chennai. The original image shown on the right, and then the Ministry of Information decided to upgrade it. And then you have all this, what's sometimes called friendly fire by officials or organisations, or sometimes just kind of fan bases in the BJP, who put out knowingly false material, which is then immediately shot down within hours and backfires. Assange did not say this, just to be clear. You've doubtless seen Modi's early career as a railway station sweeper, and then his ascent to power and his dominance of global politics. Obama is frequently shown watching Modi's speeches on CNN. Modi's always striding out, having exited Air Force One with Obama. He has had the ear of the then president, and he even got in the top here Yashoda Ben, who has fled public life. She was brought back in for a quick visit to Washington. So there's a kind of unofficial Photoshop sphere where things, in my experience, are much more likely to do damage to the brand than actually support them, and that's a cause for happiness, for some dark hope. One comment: when you want to go to the beaches and check out some hot chicks around, you're forbidden to go there. That seems to be the Twitter commentariat's verdict on window wonder. And there are a whole set of actually brilliantly sophisticated parodies, some of which take up photo montage from the 1930s, in this case John Hartfield's anti-Nazi work. Right, I wonder if, so I wanted to say just a few minutes on, maybe we should roll this into the discussion, but what I could do is just give you a 2-minute review of what remains and say that the argument I then wanted to make was that India is being convulsed by a cow protection agitation. Many Muslims and Dalits have lost their lives. When I was last in India, I asked someone I know very well, a labourer at the railway station, whether he got any WhatsApp cow slaughter videos, and he immediately produced many for me to watch, all purporting to be shot outside mosques in Pakistan. So I think there's a lot one can say here about the change from an additive to a substitutive economy of images, in which sharing of images in these new digital platforms essentially has no limits. You're not having to give away an image, as used to be the case in the subtractive film economy. And I think there's a lot of interesting work on sharing as flow, ideas of amplification. This is clearly what's driving a lot of Indian ground level politics. And WhatsApp and YouTube can be seen as channels whose width contrasts with that of the strange, confined space of the analog photograph. So I think the material dimensions and the velocities of these media pathways are all very different. They all have to be understood. So if I had a very precious analog photograph of a three-headed calf, and maybe I only had two, would I want to give one to you? I'm not sure. If I've got it on WhatsApp, you are definitely going to get it. So we've moved from the substantive to the additive. We've moved on to a rolling frontier of image abundance. And this is clearly creating a completely new ecology, a new landscape, image landscape, on which politics then feeds. So part of my, this is, you may be thinking, this has not been very anthropological. I haven't heard much work about in villages. Well, I suppose a lot of this current work, I mean, it builds upon my earlier work on the history and circulation of chromolithography, but it's also underpinned by almost 10 years of living in a village in Madhya Pradesh. So that when I see these new glossy images, in many ways images that kind of propose a sexualized fecundity to cow production, I can relate them to the earthy materiality of Govardhan Puja. And so I think of the Kia, which is kind of like productive semen, but then I think of all that wet, soggy gober. So in my mind, my experiences in thinking about the symbolic world in which all these things are circulating around, I'm left with the sense that the material is remains a huge part of all these performances. And of course that's completely true for cow protection, because cow protection, like all ideologies, is built on a complete delusion. Its myth of weightlessness assumes that if you don't kill cows, the cows somehow are going to disappear. Maybe they're going to ascend to heaven with apsaras. I know from having spent many years living in villages and visited many goshalas and seen the shocking states of goshalas, that if cow protection is really enforced, it's going to have a devastating effect on rural economies, because non-productive cattle, where are they going to go? It's a huge issue in terms of the coming impoverishment of formerly prosperous rural cattle economies. And the idea is that they're somehow going to go to these mysteriously vast, well-funded by Yogi Adityanath goshalas, none of which can cope with even 2 or 3% of what they would have to cope with. So that's what I would call analog grit. There's something completely impossible in this digital project, this immaterial, weightless project. And rather than talking about Liebig's flesh extract, maybe I should just say that my own conclusion was that, if I can find, found myself resting at Marx and Engels in the German ideology, when they talk about ideology as making things appear upside down, as if in a camera obscura. So my final point is there's a prismatic, by prismatic ideological inversion, I mean if you shine light through a prism, it inverts. The world is